Good afternoon. Welcome to the Richie Winn Show. He has degrees in geology and philosophy, so he's a scientist and a thinker. He studied other sciences like economics, physics, climatology, but his real love is politics, breaking down liberal arguments into their logical components and exposing their flaws. Here's the host of The Logical Choice. Here's Richie!
Good afternoon. This is the Richie Winn Show. I'm your host, Richie Winn, here on this wonderful Saturday afternoon. Normally, this is the point where I would give out the phone number and text line to reach me on the show here and participate, but we have a special program for you today all about climate change and the arguments for it, against it, the science behind it. It's a packed show, so I'm not going to have any time to take any calls today. You're welcome to call in next week, but there's just too much to go over. There's so much information. I'm not even going to be able to fit all of it into just this show, but I'm going to try and hit the main key points just to try and make sure that when you talk to other people in your life, whether it's people you work with, family members, people who just push this, we have to do something about climate change, climate crisis, as the media keep trying to change the nomenclature of it to try and make it seem more of an emergency. I want you to be well-armed, well-prepared, and be able to say, look, this stuff you're giving me, this is bogus. Here's why. This is the real science behind it. To be an authority, and it really does not take much. That is the big Wizard of Oz moment behind all of this. There's so many people who try to hide behind, there's thousands of these scientific experts, and they determine what is right, and they all agree, and they are in one voice, in unison, saying this. Nearly all of that description is wrong. So many of them aren't scientists. So many of the people who are scientists still don't really know what is going on. They're just parroting what other people say. And we're going to go over a whole bunch of it today. If you're just tuning into the show for the first time, like I said, my name is Richie Winn. The intro talks about my degrees. I have a degree in geology and philosophy. I'm actually going to be using a little bit of both today. In my studies for geology, a lot of that was studying climate change. Now, I'm not a climate change expert. I'm not a climate change scientist. I've read a lot of climate change papers and journal articles and information about it. I've been studying it for years, even before I was interested in geology. I even got thrown out of a geology class once for just asking questions about the climate. The teacher didn't like them very much. I'll tell you that story later. But the first thing I wanted to get to is models. In science, models are often used, and they really are bad science. Well, I don't want to say they're bad science. They are science. A better description is they are inferior science. Sometimes models are all we have. We don't have the option to look directly at the information and actually do an experiment. Even studies, when you hear studies show this, studies show that, studies don't prove anything. Experiments do. Experiments are much more rigorous, and there's a lot of controls. And even experiments, they can be designed with lots of errors in them. So when it comes to models, they really are a very basic and inferior way of doing science. It's just a lot of times it's the best we can do. We don't have the option. I participated in this when I was getting my degree. We had a group that was studying the plumes in the mantle, because there's different theories about plume theory. Some people say, oh, plumes are a real thing. We have these direct lines that go through the mantle down to the core. Some people who say, no, it's not. There are no plumes. It's just spots here and there, variation in temperature. And we were trying to put together a white paper studying all these different other journal articles to put together a summary trying to determine this. My own thought was that plumes just seem like a natural consequence. Things are going to follow the pathway of least resistance. And looking at these different papers, I was able to kind of support that. But this is just my speculation. There were some papers that support it. There were other papers that said, well, we have this data. We don't know if it fits anything. It's very murky, and this is a very simplistic version of what these climate models do. Maybe a better example would be, imagine going to a doctor. The doctor has no instruments, can do no tests, has no tools, just listens to you describe what the symptoms are, and then tries to diagnose you. Now, sometimes that's all we can do, especially if you've ever gone to WebMD. And this is why the joke when you go to WebMD is that everything comes back as cancer. Because maybe you put in, well, I've got a runny nose. Okay, well, there's one model that says it's a cold. There's another model that says, well, allergies would cause a runny nose. There's another model that would say, well, a brain tumor could cause a runny nose. You have all these lists of things that could cause a runny nose. They're all correct in that each one shows the path that could result in a runny nose being the symptom that you see, but none of them prove this one is definitely the case. That's the problem with climate models. And climate models are incredibly complex. If you think the human body is complex, climate is enormously complex. I mean, look at the stock market. Look at how much difficulty we have predicting the stock market, even a day out, let alone a year out or a decade out. And this is an entirely man-made system. We have designed it inside and out. Granted, it relies on public opinion, which is one of the most unpredictable factors in it. But we know how the stock market works inside and out. We made it, and we still can't predict that. With climate change, we're struggling to understand and explain the entire thing, let alone predict it, which is why all the predictions are, well, basically always wrong. We have these models, and we don't understand all of the things that are going on, all the principles that are factored in it, because there are positive feedbacks. Positive feedbacks are things that reinforce the same thing. There are negative feedbacks where the more you get of it, the more factors kind of reduce that sort of thing. Think of it like pushing a ball up a hill. The more you push it, the higher it goes. There's more of a push for it to roll downhill. With the positive feedbacks, it's pretty much the opposite. It's like rolling it into a valley. You just got to get over the edge, and then the gravity will carry itself. There's things beyond those feedback loops. There's things called Milankovitch cycles, which determine just how squashed the loop of the Earth's course traveling around the sun, how that looks. Do we get, because the range is huge. We do not travel around the sun in a perfect circle. There are different times throughout the year when we're closer to the sun, when we're farther away from the sun. And that rate changes. And that can absolutely affect climate change. There's another thing called the precession of equinoxes. We all know that the Earth has a little bit of a tilt to it. It's 23.5 degrees. And that determines how we have our seasons. We have winter, fall, because as the Earth goes around, sometimes we're on the side that's leaning toward the sun. Sometimes we're on the side that's leaning away from the sun. And that creates seasons. Well, that degree of tilt changes a little bit throughout history. On top of that, we have solar activity. Sometimes the Earth gets hotter, or the sun heats up. Sometimes the sun cools down. Sometimes it has more solar spots and sun flares and solar activity. Sometimes that decreases a little bit. All of these cycles come together in this incredibly complex orchestra to determine climate. Human activity is a tiny, tiny little portion of that. Now, maybe there's science saying that, yeah, maybe we're small, but we have leveraged a whole bunch of huge impacts. If the science says that, that's fine, but the science doesn't. That's the problem. So we have these models, and all of these factors. When I mentioned the positive feedbacks and the negative feedbacks, within each of those categories are many, many different versions. We still don't understand the carbon cycle, how carbon dioxide goes. It gets stored in the oceans. It can get stored in rocks. It can get released from lava. It is stored in plants. It gets released when plants get burned or when hydrocarbons get burned. That burning gas and oil produces CO2. But how much of this is a driver? How much of it is an effect? It's all very complex. One of the positive feedbacks that has had, where it's basically a thing that, like rolling a ball downhill, gets worse as it gets more powerful. We have had multiple periods throughout the Earth's history, this is over billions of years, of the Earth being a snowball Earth. Now, the reason why this is a positive feedback loop is because one of the most important aspects of global warming, of climate change, of how hot it's going to be in the Earth, is called the albedo. And that is a measure of how much of the sun's activity, the solar activity, how much of that is reflected back into space versus how much is absorbed. This is why the moon is so bright. The moon does not produce any light, but it has a relatively, it's actually kind of a low albedo. It's mostly just because the sun is just so amazingly bright that the moon reflects a decent portion of light. And that's why we see it, because of the moon's albedo. The Earth has an albedo as well, and it changes depending on how reflective it is. So, for instance, if it starts getting to the point where ice ages are taking over, glaciation is starting to cover more and more of the Earth, we get to the point where there's a tipping point where once you have enough ice, that ice is very reflective. So very little of the heat is making it into the atmosphere. Well, what happens when very little heat makes it in? It gets colder. You get more ice. And it's a cyclical event that can turn into a snowball Earth. So you might be asking, well, how do we ever get out of that? If it's just once the Earth gets entirely covered in ice, how do we ever change that? Volcanoes. As a geologist, I love volcanoes. They're so much fun. They're great to study. And volcanoes have a huge impact on the climate. There are things where we can even have, they're called traps. They're the Siberian traps were one of the things that probably caused one of the biggest mass extinctions in the Earth's history. And it's more than just a volcano. Picture it as like the Grand Canyon if it were to just fissure and have lava just constantly flowing out for hundreds of years, thousands of years, possibly even millions of years in some cases, of lava flowing out, all of it degassing, throwing lots and lots of different chemicals into the atmosphere, and melting ice. These are the sorts of things that factor into this incredibly complex model that we don't really understand. Even to the extent that we do understand it, it's still difficult to model because the computer programming is very, very difficult to capture all of this. First off, we have to agree on what is a proper equation for some activity. What's the proper equation for, let's say, warmer climates might stimulate more plant growth? Well, that plant growth is then going to use more carbon dioxide and produce more oxygen as it grows. So what impact is that going to have? If that reduces CO2, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas, does that mean it's going to make it cooler? If so, then that would be a negative feedback loop. How do you model just that one particular element? How do you model how much of the plant's going to grow? And that's a question you have to know the answer to if you want an accurate model. The biggest question that you have to know is regarding albedo. Clouds have nearly all of the Earth's albedo, other than the ice caps, is really determined by how much of a cloud cover that we have. Clouds reflect they're white. Obviously they're made of water vapor. They reflect a tremendous amount of visible light and radiation. That makes the Earth cooler. What's the cloud cover going to be next year, a decade from now? Is it going to be more clouds, fewer clouds? None of the models take cloud cover into account. How on earth can you have an accurate model that doesn't take cloud cover into account? It's impossible. A lot of these other factors, whether they're the positive feedback loops, negative feedback loops, if they can't come up with a good equation, they'll just throw a number in there. Well, we measured it at this. Let's just assume that is going to be our standard forever going forward. You've just created a huge limitation in your model, but it doesn't stop them from doing anything because so much of this is politically driven. I'm going to get to this later when I talk about consensus and how people react to the skeptics. They don't react like it's proper science. Consensus doesn't exist in proper science. The idea that you would know what the answer is and then design your model to fit that is a complete antithesis of what science should be. This model-driven science, unfortunately, it's the best we have. We don't have a way to do experiments. We don't have a way to set up a secondary Earth and then change one variable to measure with ours to see what the difference is. I'm going to explain more about what we can measure and what's right about it and what's wrong about it when we come back. Stay tuned to The Richie Winn Show, The Logical Choice.